Hi, welcome back. This is FSX 404. Today I'm going to answer one of the questions I get asked most often. How do I visually line up with the runway? My best answer to this question is plan out your flight a little bit before you fly it. As actual pilots, before we go to an airport, we always plan out our route of flight, and if the flight is VFR, we'll plan out our visual approach into that airport. I'm going to show you some of my actual plans. As you can see, this is one of my actual flight plans I did from Hawthorne into French Valley. You can see where I have my frequencies, I have my headings, my wind correction, my time en route, and in the end you can see I actually have a little diagram of the airport with all the little information I need on it. And you can actually tell where I put an arrow where I'm coming from. And for this airport I actually planned out the route of entry into the traffic pattern. As you can see, this is an uncontrolled airport, so I'm going to overfly the midfield, then do a 270-degree turn onto the downwind, come back and land. You don't have to do anything as fancy as this with the flight simulator. The second slides I'm going to show you is some of my local flights that I've done, mostly airport hopping. And for this, I'm usually familiar with the area, but still I drew out the airport, I drew out the traffic pattern altitude, all the basic information, and the main thing, I also put an arrow where I'm coming from, so I know what to expect from the ATC, what the ATC expects from me, and how to enter the traffic pattern as easily as possible. This will only take a couple of minutes before every flight. You guys can draw it out, draw a little arrow where you're coming from, put some basic airport information on that piece of paper, and have it in front of you when you go to land. I'm going to go over some basic planning of visual approaches and procedures, but if you're flying anything bigger than a Dash 8, what I'm about to go over will really not work. But to those of you who want to fly bigger airplanes from time to time, my best advice is to fly IFR with the IFR flight plan and let the ATC line you up with the runway. Once you're lined up, just use the VASI PAPI lights to keep you on the glide slope and land. For smaller airplanes, including the little jet fighters, Learjets, twins, and that kind of stuff, there are a few basic rules you should follow when approaching an airport for landing, which will help you out when lining up. Keep in mind that every airport has its own traffic pattern procedures, but since we're only dealing with Microsoft Flight Simulator, I will go over some standard stuff which will help you out in most cases. Keep in mind this is a basic overview and this is only for Microsoft Flight Simulator use. I'm going to start out with a basic airport with a runway 25 and runway 7 layout with a standard traffic pattern, 1000 feet AGL for small airplanes and 1500 feet AGL for larger twins and turbine airplanes. Usually the airport will have a left or right traffic pattern, but for convenience, unless the airport has a few other airplanes in the traffic pattern or has other restrictions, the ATC will accommodate arriving airplanes to a traffic pattern on either side, whichever one is more convenient. The airport I have set up will have 4 basic visual entry points which we'll use to enter the traffic pattern. Depending upon where we're coming from and which runway is in use, we'll use one of the visual reference points to enter the traffic pattern. For the sake of the argument, we'll use the runway 25 for this exercise. Anything within 30 degrees north or 30 degrees south of the runway threshold will be considered a straight-in approach. So if we're approaching the airport within that 30 north, 30 south degree area, we'll do a straight-in approach. Basically, once we have the runway in sight, we'll line up with the runway and land. A few things to keep in mind. Once we are within 5 miles of the airport, we should be at the standard traffic pattern altitude, 1000 feet AGL for smaller airplanes, 1500 feet for bigger airplanes, twins, and turbine airplanes. In addition to being at the traffic pattern altitude, we should also slow down the airplane to its approach speed. At 5 miles away from the runway, we'll also put our landing gear down. And the last thing we'll do at this point is the first pre-landing checklist. Once we are within 2 miles from the airport, we'll slow the airplane down to the final approach speed, we'll put in full flaps, we'll begin our descent onto the airport, and we'll perform our final pre-landing checklist. If we are approaching the airport in between the 30 degrees to 90 degrees off the runway threshold, we'll fly to the northeast or southeast visual entry point. At that entry point, we should be at the traffic pattern altitude, 1,000 feet AGL for smaller airplanes, 1,500 feet AGL for twin airplanes and turbine airplanes, and the airplane should be slowed down to its approach speed. We should also put our landing gear down at this point and perform the first pre-landing checklist. From a northeast or southeast visual entry point, we'll turn onto the base leg of the traffic pattern and turn on final when it is appropriate. Once on final, we'll slow the airplane down to its final approach speed and we'll do our final pre-landing checklist. One thing I really want to talk about is when to turn on final from base. That really depends on the airplane and the experience. It is okay to overshoot or undershoot the runway a little bit, especially in Microsoft Flight Simulator. But once you're on that final, even if you're not perfectly lined up with the runway, just make small adjustments to get you on the center line and you'll be fine. From the example I'm showing, this is one of my actual flights. You can see that I'm turning onto the final, and at this point you can see the runway, and although it looks like I'm lined up, I'm not. I just undershot it a little bit, which is okay. See, in a few seconds I make my little adjustments, and at this point I'm lined up with the runway, and you can't actually see the runway because my big head is blocking it. But as you saw, as I was turning on to the final, I really undershot it a little bit, but in the end I adjusted for it, so which is perfectly fine. If we are coming from any other direction than previously mentioned, then we'll fly to the northwest or southwest visual entry point. Once we are at the northwest or southwest entry point, we'll be at the traffic pattern altitude, again 1,000 feet AGL for small airplanes, 1,500 feet AGL for twins or turbine powered aircraft, and we'll be at the airplane's approach speed. We'll also put our landing gear down and perform our first pre-landing checklist. From these entry points, we'll turn our airplane and head out straight for the center of the runway. This path should put us straight on for a 45-degree entry onto the downwind. Another question that I keep being asked frequently is how far from the runway do I fly my downwind leg of the traffic pattern? Well, that really depends. The downwind traffic pattern leg should be flown anywhere from 1/2 mile up to 1 mile from the runway. That depends on the size of the airplane you're flying and the traffic pattern altitude. Of course, 1/2 mile being for smaller airplanes 1,000 feet AGL, 1 mile being for larger airplanes 1,500 feet AGL. Once we are on downwind, we'll fly the standard traffic pattern until we land. 45 degrees to the runway threshold, we'll turn on base, then we'll turn on final when appropriate. Once on final, we'll do the final pre-landing checklist and land. Now that I've explained basic traffic pattern entries from different directions, for part 2 of this lesson I will actually use a real airport with real traffic pattern entry points and show you how that works out in real life.